Hi, you're watching Saturday in the Woodworking Shop with Andrew Pitts, where we talk things woodworking. I got asked a question about my drying of my wood. How do I do that? And the question was, do I use a kiln? Do I use steam in the kiln? Let's start with the kiln part. Yes, I do use a kiln, and here's my solar kiln. There's really a couple ways to dry wood. One is to air dry, and that's a stack of lumber being air dried. Another way to dry the wood is to use a commercial steam kiln where the kiln is heated with steam. For the small guys, you have a couple of kilns you can use. One is a dehumidification kiln, which is essentially a big box with a dehumidifier and some heaters in it. Keep the humidity low, keep the heat high enough, and you're in business. Or in my case, I use a solar kiln. Now, really the question is, why kiln dry in the first place? Well, the reason I started kiln drying wasn't really about drying the wood. It was about getting the core temperature of the wood high enough to kill the powder post beetle larvae. You have to get that core temperature of your lumber up around 130, 135 degrees for an hour to kill the larvae, which here in the east tends to find its way into your lumber and then find its way by making a hole to escape the lumber later on. So I wanted to kill those larvae. But as a side benefit, I get my wood down to the 7 to 8% moisture content that I said last week is where I like to have it before I start working it. Now, if you're air drying, around here on the east, you can maybe get down to about 14% moisture content. And then you got to take your wood inside and let it sit for a long, long time to get that moisture to finally come on down to the 7 to 8%. And so that's tough to do. So with kiln drying, you get a little less case hardening. With the commercial kiln drying, it's because they're able to put steam back into the kiln and put moisture back into the outside fibers so that they don't dry so much faster than the inside of the planks. With the solar kiln, if you keep the kiln closed up at night after the sun goes down, then the humidity builds up in the kiln and tends to resaturate the outside fibers of the wood some to make them more in equilibrium with the inside that is still at a higher moisture content. And the whole board tends to come down in moisture more evenly, and so I find I get a little less case hardening that way. Now this kiln is essentially just a big box. Mine is 12 feet across. I got a couple of big doors on the end that open up. I got a couple of vents, high and low, to allow me to control the heat in the kiln. The business end of the kiln is the roof, and that roof is clear plastic in my case. And that's pointing at the sun. That entire kiln is pointing due south, and the angle on that roof is the same as my latitude. And that makes it so the kiln points, or excuse me, the roof points directly at the sun when the sun is at the equator. And as in the summer, the sun will be higher, and in the winter, the sun will be lower. Okay, now on my kiln, I have a small thermometer here. It's actually kind of a long thermometer. Fits in this little port that I made in the door and goes on in, and I can then keep track of the temperature. Right now you can see it's 100 degrees inside the kiln. I also have fans on the inside of the kiln which I can control from a set of switches that I have here mounted on the side of the kiln. So let's go ahead and open the door and show you the inside. Okay, so here I have the doors open. You can see the full width. Like I say, it's 12 feet. The kiln is built regular frame construction, 2x4 frame construction. Use salt-treated T111 paneling on the outside. Insulated all the walls with regular fiberglass insulation. And then I used an inside sheathing of 1/2-inch blue styrofoam. It's not the most durable for the purpose, but if you're careful, it'll help, and you can paint it black, and so it absorbs the sunlight and insulates it at the same time. All the wood sits on 4x4s that I have every 21 inches or so, and it makes a nice flat surface. Once the stack is built with you know, an air gap between each layer, it's called stickering, then on top I put a big piece of plywood that's painted black, reinforced, and on top of that I put these lengths of 4-foot long 2x4 every 21 inches, over each one over a sticker, you know, column of stickers. And then I use these orange tie-down straps, they're ratcheting tie-down straps, to tie down the entire stack so that it stays flat during the drying process. If you want to see me loading the solar kiln, I'll link to one of my videos on milling and drying. At the top of the kiln I have 2 attic ventilation fans. They used to be hooked up on temperature switches, but those didn't last very long in this environment, and so now they're just directly hardwired, and I simply turn them on in the morning and turn them off in the afternoon. Once the stack is installed, I take this piece of this black cloth that, you know, is used to cover lumber that comes from the lumber yard, and I hang that cloth from this baffle all the way down to the top of the stack, and so that cuts off any airflow that would escape coming through the stack. I want the air to go through the fan, out there where the collector is, and then back through the stack and up to the fan again, and I don't want any airflow short-circuiting. I've got my big thermometer in the coming through the door. I can measure the temperature, and it works nicely. Now the vents, I normally keep my vents closed all the time because I only get about 6 hours of good sunlight here. I've got so many trees surrounding the property. So I need to have my vents closed to build up temperature. But if you have a very sunny area where you have sun all day long, then you're going to want to be able to adjust your vents open to cut down on the temperature a little bit. Now with the kiln empty, I keep the vents wide open all the time so the temperature doesn't build up, because the temperature in the kiln can get high enough to melt the styrofoam, and that's actually happened on the tops of my doors. The styrofoam's actually melted when I had the vents closed, and I shouldn't have, with an empty kiln, and it melted the styrofoam. Now some people stack their kiln by hand, and you can do that. I happen to have a tractor that I use. The tractor has forklifts, and the forklifts are able to pick up a stack probably about a foot high and set it, and then I'll go ahead and I'll get another stack a foot high, and I'll just build up until I have, you know, about 4 feet high stack of lumber. And this kiln can actually run probably 1,000 board feet, but I don't get that much sun. So I usually dry a whole lot less than that, just because I need my temperature to come up. See, the more wood you have in the stack, the harder it's going to be to get the temperature to come up, because that wood's absorbing all that heat. As a matter of fact, when your stack is new, when it's fresh and full of moisture, it's really hard to get the temperature up, because all the sunlight that comes in is causing the moisture to evaporate, and that's just taking all that heat and turning it into, you know, turning the moisture into vapor, and not allowing the temperature of the wood to come up. So you won't see the temperature of the wood starting to come up until your wood's been in here for a few weeks and has gotten kind of dry. As far as timing goes, the fastest I've ever dried a charge of wood is probably about 6 weeks. The slowest is when I dry over the winter, and then we're talking months. I could put a charge in here in September, and come April, it maybe won't be dry yet, because the sun is so low and the temperatures outside are so cold that you just cannot get that drying effect. But in the heat of summer with a smaller charge, you know, maybe 6 weeks and it's all done. By the way, you can learn a whole lot more about solar kilns than I can tell you in a short video if you go to woodweb.com and just do a search for solar kiln design.